Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue. We are pleased to be bringing you this very timely conversation about how government and industry are responding to global supply chain risks and what modern tools and strategies are available to help support more resilient supply chains and secure vital infrastructure for global trade. My name is Maggie Lake, and I'll be your host for the event. Now, recent incidents like the blockage of the Suez Canal or the COVID-19 induced breakdown in semiconductor production in Taiwan expose critical weaknesses or stress points in global supply chains. Amid growing risk from climate disasters, international conflict, and other disruptions, there is now an increased focus on strengthening supply chains by improving how we anticipate risks, mitigate crises, or manage disruptions when disaster strikes. A modern economy demands modern solutions. One such approach is increasing the capability for persistent monitoring that decision makers can utilize via space-based technology as well as artificial intelligence. Today, we're excited to hear from a stellar lineup of experts and practitioners in this arena. They'll share what lessons they've gathered from 2020, what's needed to innovate and strengthen our global supply chains, and how Earth observation and real-time data collection and analytics can help. Thank you all for tuning in, and a big thanks to BlackSky for helping us make this event possible. Now, before we get started, we want to make sure we hear from you, our audience. We have many hundreds of people tuned in here on Zoom, as well as watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our audience. This is how you can join in and participate, and we want you to. If you're on Zoom, click on the Q&A button below and submit your questions, and be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is events@foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media as well. Be sure to use the hashtag #SupplyChainIntel. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Gilman Louie, Commissioner at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and co-founder and partner of Alsop Louie Partners. That is an early stage technology venture capital firm that focuses on disruptive and innovative technology. Gilman has a long record of public service and entrepreneurship and has received dozens of awards, including the CII Directors Award. Welcome to the program, Gilman. Thanks so much for joining us. I can't think of a better person to help walk us through some of these challenges. And I'd like to start by getting, I think, a risk assessment from you. You know, we've seen so many disruptions in various supply chains this year. Is this the new normal we're facing?
I think it's going to intensify. One of the things that we learned out of the COVID crisis was how fragile our supply chains are. And we had to understand that prior to COVID-19, our supply chain systems were designed to be fundamentally efficient, right? That's reducing the amount of inventory somebody needs to carry, reducing the amount of slack in the system so that we would have just-in-time arrival as you produce goods or services or actually even provide critical infrastructure and services. What we've learned is those systems, as efficient as they are not particularly resilient to fundamental breakdowns. And as we kind of come out of the pandemic, we're seeing not just traditional supply chain challenges, but even in our information supply chain. So we had to rethink about how we do our business, how we perform our missions, how we conduct our day-to-day lives, and put resilience ahead of efficiency. And until we do so, we'll continue to have these kinds of supply chain breakdowns.
And that is a massive challenge. And I know everyone's going to be thinking about how to balance that. They don't want to give up all the efficiencies, but how can we do both maybe in the best way? What are the tools and technologies at our disposal for mitigating the threats to critical infrastructure or concentrating on that resilient part of the equation?
Well, you know, we have a lot of modern tools and the tools are getting better. So that's the exciting opportunity that's in front of us. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, we remember operations room, which were fundamentally big whiteboards. and maps, people with
Yeah.
pens and strings and, draw lines and then we modernized, so to speak. We introduced spreadsheets, right? But spreadsheets are just a more efficient way of us doing what we would manually do anyway. With the advent and use of things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, combined with our ability to fuse data and sensors from the sky, from the ground, from the internet, that would give us a new capability to be able to turn the dials between efficiency and resilience to find the right balance. It will also help us find those weak links, the thing that nobody thinks about, because all of the information and all of the goods arrive at a certain point in time and somebody drives a truck into the thing and the whole thing that's totally collapsed. We as humans aren't really equipped to be able to ingest all that information and do that kind of analysis. Computers and algorithms love crunching that data. So I think there's not just great opportunities in front of us. There are a lot of startups and existing companies beginning to apply these modern techniques and technologies against this problem.
I'm interested that you're talking about sort of linking that all together, because I think a lot of businesses are aware of the power of AI, data. Big data is everywhere. We talk about it all the time. Talk to me about how that outer space part of it can plug in as a part of not only the supply chain, but really a solution. I guess it makes sense because we're looking at global supply chains reach around the world now. But how can that plug in a way that makes a difference?
What satellites and Earth observation from space gives us an ability of not just being able to click a picture or getting a piece of useful data over a piece of Earth or geospatial space, but it allows us to collect data over time. So as the satellites are zooming around in Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit, we're gathering lots of data, and data is critical for predictive modeling. So for the first thing we have is a base of information that we can do predictions, and predictions are fundamentally using math to do statistical analysis to say, if all these things have happened in the past, and 99.9% of the time, so when you see these 5 things, then the next time you see it, this thing will most likely happen. That really helps planners begin to think through what they're seeing. Now, the other critical component besides this kind of persistent surveillance and observation is the ability to integrate other forms of data. So when you take Earth observation from afar at a kind of Earth level, and you integrate it with ground-based sensors that are like they're right at your cell phone, right, collecting data, we then can create very useful models that gives us a prediction. So we can do things that historically were considered impossible to do either from space or from ground. Right, this kind of microclimate prediction. I mean, if we think about the ability to predict a wind shear or a particular wind pattern in a local area, in the past it was like, no, the math is just too complex. We just can't do that. But we're seeing today, and it's not just companies, but governments are beginning to invest in the kind of compute necessary to do those levels of prediction.
Which is extraordinary, but it strikes me that, so we've got all this amazing capability. How do we decipher it all and distribute it in real time? Are those mechanisms in place? And do we have to think about sort of the entire chain of events, not just all the data points?
We have some work to do in front of us, right? Because all of our systems were built for humans, right? So when we think about humans. right, pesky humans. So when we think about sharing, it's like, call somebody, text a message, right? And all of our information gets converted to what a human can understand and what a human can communicate at human speeds and human scales. While machines actually don't need that. I mean, we don't need to actually see a computer doesn't need to see a picture on the screen. It can just take the RGB signals and do analysis off the signals, right? And so the first thing is building our information and analytical systems so that they are machine ready and to be operated at machine speed. So that's number one. Number two, rethink our sharing models, right? We don't share well for lots of reasons, right? We have proprietary data. Companies go, well, my information is important and I just want to hoard it for myself as my competitive advantage. Government says, well, our information is special, right? Because we don't want to disclose how we collect that information. And so we need to rethink about information sharing and sit down and have, to solve certain classes of problem scheme, both industry, government, and other non-state actors who are playing these arenas to figure out what are the necessary pieces of the data to be able to fuse together that will help us get to that prediction that will make it better for everybody. And it's okay. Some will try to sell it. Not a problem. If we can meter it, sell it, and do it in real time, that's okay. More power to the companies can make money. Not okay if the information arrives the day after the event,
Right.
because that's not particularly useful.
I think this is such a critical point that you just brought up, because what you're talking about is a sort of collaboration across public and private, across competitive within industries. This is a huge change. I mean, do we have any groundwork right now that we can use to sort of, as an example, maybe, or as a precedent?
Yeah, well, I think even the old era, let's go back to the, moving atoms around rather than electrons around, right? In the old era, companies like FedEx revolutionized how we thought about supply chains, right? They introduced hub and spoke. They put information systems, even though they're the old school kind of the way we kind of look at client server kinds of architectures. Nevertheless, they increase efficiency of delivery of goods parcels by an order of magnitude, right? And that required them to put together information chains that went all the way out to even the end user who was mailing packages out of their small shops. In fact, those shipping companies, because I remember this when I was young, they would walk into my office. I was a young CEO starting my company, and they said, "Here's a computer. Here's and it's all free. Like, we'll give it to you if you use this, right? We'll lower your shipping costs. We'll give you a discount." So there are market mechanisms that worked in the old world that can be applied to the new world, into this digital, physical hybrid world that we're going to live in. And we take those lessons of the past of cooperation and we apply it to things that are of critical importance, not only for commerce, but the protection of the country, as well as making everybody's lives a little bit more predictable in this very unpredictable world that we live in.
That's a great point. And I think it's important to reach for whatever examples or lessons we have as we try to build this, because I think time is of the essence. Gilman, we're going to continue. I just want to bring in a question from our audience. And this is, do you see high revisit constellations combined with AI machine learning platforms reducing the uncertainty of supply chains and even predicting potential disruptions?
I think it's going to be a critical component. It's insufficient by themselves, right? You can't observe everything from low Earth orbit, but you can observe a lot, and you can collect massive amounts of data that can be analyzed in a way that helps put these predictions. But there's another thing they do. There's a technique we call tipping and queuing, right? Where we look for a series of clues, the tip, and then what we do is then queue other resources, right, to put more energy on the problem that we're looking at. Space is a great place to tip, because we can see things from space from afar with the big macro lens and say, look, there's some weird activities happening here, right? There's some ships that are kind of clogging up a canal somewhere, right? Or, there's this really bad weather pattern that's moving over. Okay, turn on a bunch of ground-based sensors, kick in the algorithm, start doing the compute, because we think a problem may happen here. Don't waste your compute in a place where nothing is happening. Focus your energies over here. So this tipping and queuing using space as a tip is a very powerful set of tools, and those satellites in orbit are going to be major contributors, providing us with informational clues on how to better use our resources of sensing and compute.
That's amazing, and I know so many of us are thinking about the Suez situation as a perfect example, of what needs to change, what can happen, how we can work through this. We have another question coming in from Thomas Lord. Are we using the wrong definition of supply chain efficiency? The description you gave was based on capital efficiency, reducing the capital deployed in supply chain. This is as opposed to supply chain efficiency defined as the ability to, where were we? Ability to assure the most efficient operation of the organization, including reducing the risk of operational slowdown or complete shutdown.
I mean, that's absolutely right on target, right? I mean, we need to stop looking at systems at just the micro level, right? Like how, measure the point of cost between moving our good from this point to this point, and look at the macro picture, right? It's the aggregation of everything that you're moving across that supply chain, risk adjusted, right? And a lot of people, and here's the mistake that a lot of folks make in looking at risk. They look at risk as simply a probabilistic outcome. They say we have these crazy math things that I was helping my daughter through her math lessons, and she was coming to me and asking, what's this thing called expected value, right? When you say, here's the risk of this bad thing happening, you say, we have at least tiny percentage chance. But if it happens as bad, then it's going to cost you a lot of money. So you just multiply that little risk by the amount of cost, and that's your expected value. Okay. It gives you a false sense of security, because when that black swan hits you, it doesn't hit you at that little tiny percent of the amount of damage. It hits you the whole thing. And so there are certain things you do in algorithms where you say, look, at this level of cost, I need to change my calculus. And you can only do that at a systems level. So when we optimize the supply chain, the person who asked that question is right on the money. You got to look at it holistically across the whole system, not just a point in time of these kind of simplistic measurements.
Yeah, and I think that these kind of conversations are going to help build that. As we talk about solutions, we have another one, and you might have just partially answered that, because literally as it was coming in, you were talking about Black Swan, but Ernie Hayden, founder, principal of 443 Consulting from Washington, is asking, when the Suez was blocked by a large ship, what were we thinking observations at the time? What's the next Black Swan event for the supply chain?
The whole point of a black swan is not predictable, right?
But obviously, Gilman, we all think you have a crystal ball.
So here's what I always start with for black swan predictions, right? It's kind of it only makes sense if you play video games a lot, and it starts with the things that are impossible, that will never ever happen to you. Like you say, I will never get hit by a car, or, lightning will never strike me, right? Get the list of never will, because in that list buried are the black swans. Because your assumptions in building systems is, I get to ignore this list. It'll never happen. I worry about all the stuff that most likely are going to happen or reasonably will happen. I don't need to worry about the stuff that's never going to happen. And every time a black swan happens, right? And we just went through one with COVID-19, right? It's like we see it, we dismiss it. It'll never happen to us in our lifetime. It's some, asteroid will never hit the earth, whatever, right? We don't ever have to worry about this. An earthquake will never hit Washington, D.C. And then it happens. So start with the never list, right? And ask yourself, do you have the tools to track your never list?
Yeah.
And what are the precursor events, even though you think it will never happen, that will have to happen in the sequence before the big event happens? And then put sensors on those and track those. And while it does have some level of cost, that's your hedge against the black swans.
Absolutely. And watch out for the two maybes at the same time as well. I know we certainly have seen in financial markets, sometimes the black swan is a confluence of events that one at a time you thought you could handle, but both happening at the same time is certainly problematic. Gilman, that was such a great conversation. You are a perfect person to shed light on this intersection between technology and space and supply chains. We're so lucky we were able to have you today. Thank you so much. And please promise us you'll come back again.
Thank you for having me. It's great being here.
Gilman Louie for us. Now, we want to keep the conversation going and bring in our esteemed panelists. So please help me welcome Dr. Kelly Fletcher, Principal Director to the Deputy Chief Information Officer, Resources and Analysis at the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. Bob Kalowski, Director, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's National Risk Management Center at the Department of Homeland Security. Retired Colonel John Mills, Senior Project Engineer, Federal Civil and Homeland Security Programs, the Aerospace Corporation. And Brittany Masalo-Salo, Senior Director for Commercial Diplomacy and Multilateral Affairs at 3M. Thank you to all of us for joining us. As we said at the top of the program, this is such a timely and really important conversation given everything we've seen over the last year. And Brittany, I'd like to start with you because of that. I mean, 3M was on the front line of what we were discussing, having to deal with these multiple challenges. The company has at least 25 product categories, at least, with a huge global supply chain. What was the experience like this year?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Maggie. 2020 was an unprecedented year. Gilman's insights were spot on, very insightful. And, a lot of the things he said, 3M is beginning to live through, or we have lived through. I'll start by, telling a little bit about 3M. We're a US headquartered multinational company. We have operations all across the world on every single continent, plants in over 60 different countries, sales in nearly every single one. Our supply chains are complex, they're complicated, they crisscross all around the world. So we are no stranger to supply chain vulnerabilities, but also developing those tools for supply chain resiliency. If you bear with me for just a moment, I'll talk about a couple of the things that we see in terms of supply chain disruptions, supply chain vulnerabilities. And then, throughout this conversation, happy to share some of the ways that we've worked to mitigate those. The black swans, Gilman said it precisely. The black swans are the things that you can't predict. You start with your never list and work backwards from there. 3M thought that we were prepared for the next global pandemic. We had lessons learned from SARS and MERS and other epidemics. We had maintained surge capacity to be able to upscale quickly. We had to make sure we didn't have sole source providers for some of our raw materials that we needed. But in the end, nobody could have predicted the magnitude of COVID-19. We saw governments responding in ways that were helpful. We saw governments responding in ways that weren't helpful at all. We saw a lack of collaboration and cohesiveness in a time when it was needed most. What I will share is kind of 3M's hero story. We were able to increase capacity of our PPE, in particular, our N95s, in ways that would have normally taken months. We did it in weeks or sometimes even in days. We showed how advanced manufacturing can be very advantageous in responding to these types of disruptions. We showed how that when grit and innovation and resources are applied, these can be overcome. But it definitely has opened the conversation like the one that we're having now. But what can we do to see around the bend? How can we use data analytics such as AI and enhanced surveillance to understand what may be coming down the pipeline, whether it's natural disasters such as COVID-19 or weather patterns that are being exacerbated by climate change or other ESG factors, or whether it's market fluctuations that may cause an unknown shift that ripples out across several different supply chains. So glad to be having this conversation today, and I'm looking forward to the insights from my other panelists.
I think that's a great point, Brittany. And Bob, I think what we saw was people, and it was extraordinary what was able to happen during the pandemic. The on the fly, people trying to get supplies where they were needed, and extraordinary. I mean, people moved mountains, and it was extraordinary. And I think it's opened up a lot of hope. But it would be nice for us to now in the reset think about how we can do this in a more organized fashion, right? How we can build this in and not have to put the strain on. So Bob, what are some of the tools and technology innovations that you're looking at that can help address the situations that we described now that we're all catching our breath?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I am, as you mentioned, Maggie, the director of the National Risk Management Center within the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Supply chains is one of my major areas of focus. And, we are starting, I come at this from a national security, national economic security, public health, safety, well-being perspective. And to specifically answer your question, starting with tools by looking at this through a framework of what are national critical functions. So we publicly identified 55 national critical functions, things like generate electricity and support community health, provide medical care, transport materials by pipeline, by air. These are things that we as a country need to have the ability to do. And then we're taking a risk approach to understand, going backwards to some of the themes of Gilman's talk, we're doing a risk approach to understand what can degrade our ability to deliver that function. And that's where you talk about critical commodities, critical supplies. In the case of the pandemic, we actually identified 4 factors that could impact critical functions. Actually, let me change that, 5 factors. One was the availability of critical commodities. Another was the availability of essential workers to work, to get their work done. Another was the demand on the system. Was the system taxed? And then there was the converse of that, was there a lack of demand, which caused flex in the systems, which caused systems to fail. And then finally, cyber sorts of incidents. And so using this model of critical functions, we're architecting our understanding of what commodities are absolutely essential for the well-being of the country. And that's where the government should be working to invest in more resilience, more planning, more analysis, but hitting the themes of this conference, do it in partnership with industry, work on risk identification through the government and industry working together. The government has the mandate to make sure that critical things work for the American people. That's what we're getting paid for. Those critical things come from companies like 3M, come from other things. And we want to partner to understand where there are potential gaps in resilience, and are there things that government activity can do to stimulate filling some of those gaps in resilience. And so that's the philosophy we come. And then, of course, analytics are behind that, some of the things that we're talking about earlier. Let me point to specifically then in the pandemic, we actually looked at it really focused around information and communications technology. And we worked with industry to identify findings from the pandemic experience. And the 6 recommendations we left with that will be guiding our activities going forward in partnership with industry. One is to improve proactive risk classification. Second is to encourage and enable and promote the idea of mapping supply chains. 3, on a policy end, are there ways to sort of incentivize moving toward a broader supplier networks and regional footprints so that there's less of a single source? You see this particularly with critical minerals, critical materials. 4th, again, stimulate through R&D development of standardized mapping and other illumination tools within the government. We can take advantage of some commercial tools that are available. And then, encourage alternative planning and logistics and transportation. And so those are the kinds of things we found. I think big companies are noting the same thing too. But it really does come down to having more ability to know your suppliers, know your supply chains, know in some depth. And then when you see concentrated sources of risk, take activity.
Yeah.
What you saw the president do through the American Supply Chain Executive Order was say that the federal government is going to try to help do things to change, make it easier not to take concentrated sources of risk.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. Kelly, how is the Department of Defense approaching this? And I'm thinking about just the breadth of your supply chain. You have so many contractors you work with. How are you approaching this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that I'm so excited to hear what 3M is doing. And I think that's what we're hoping that all of our suppliers are doing, right? So I'm working to understand my own supply chain. And the way that I'm doing that is really through supply chain illumination tools. That's like the first thing I do is there's commercially available tools and they help me better understand my supply chain. And once I look at those, I have hundreds of thousands of vendors, right? So I'm buying things, and then the things I'm buying, there are subs producing a lot of the piece parts of that. So it's a huge supply chain. And we really at DoD can't get the full breadth and depth of it without our partnerships with industry. So I'm just so excited to hear what 3M said, but we're counting on these partnerships and we're counting on them leveraging both commercially available tools and then information that's provided by organizations like CISA. And also in DoD, we reach out to our defense industrial base pretty regularly with information for them. The other thing I want to highlight is from the CIO seat, right? I care a lot about software. So not just things, but actually the software that makes my things work. And so I care about the provenance of the software. And as we talk a little bit about efficiency, I know that it may be most efficient to have my software written one place and tested somewhere else, or maybe I glue together software that's been written all over the world. But I think it's important for folks to know, for our partners to know, what are they providing us with? Where was it made? Where was it tested? I think it's important for them to know what is their cybersecurity posture of their internal networks. And this is how we're going to start to think about risk, and that's software and it's hardware. But we value efficiency. But sort of as we touched on before, efficiency without resiliency or security isn't valuable to me.
That's right. John, I want to take it to you because we're talking about, by the way, John is worth noting, so interested in and felt this conversation was so important that he's joining us from the road, literally from the road. And we appreciate that, John. But,
thank you, Maggie.
When we're talking about 3M and DoD, these are very large organizations. But as I listen to Kelly talk about really diving into that supply chain and understanding everything about where the source material is coming from, how difficult does that get when we're looking at the scope of the supply chain? Yes, there are those giants, but we have small, mid-sized firms all over, threaded throughout that. I mean, this is very complex in a very quick turnaround. How does that make it more difficult to get some of those answers or to get that kind of reliability and security that we're looking for?
Well, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Maggie, for having me. And yes, so you're in many ways talking about the base or the source componentry of the componentry, and having confidence in that we know the heritage and the pedigree of that material, and we can trust it as it moves up the supply chain, is integrated with other units and items that become systems. So we've been working on the supply chain issue hard for 20 years. When I say we, and I'm retired out of the Department of Defense, both as a uniform and a senior civilian, been working on this hard for a number of years, and we want to continue to drill down so we have better strategic clarity of the entire situation. So that's really in many ways kind of the crown jewel of what we are seeking. And a word I haven't heard used yet is dashboard, and senior leaders, planners, decision makers through hopefully through modern AI, artificial intelligence, we can deliver that air quote dashboard that everybody really wants and really seeks, that can give us that clarity and pervasiveness across the environment. And the reality is we still are not there with that air quote dashboard that will provide real-time data to the decision makers, planners, to have that vision across the entire enterprise. So through the use of advanced artificial intelligence, autonomy, things like that, we can finally deliver that mythical dashboard that is really, it's been kind of referenced by several of the my colleagues here, that we can provide that clarity and that to really find truth and make decisions at the right time.
I absolutely, fantastic point to bring up. And Brittany, I see you shaking your head when he's talking about that. We have so many, other aspects of life that we're getting used to dashboards and the ease of use of them. Are you looking at 3M? How important is that? And talk to me a little bit about that. Brings me to the workforce component of it. I mean, you can have the best technology, the best systems, but you need people, as Gilman pointed out, to operate them and understand them. There's a human element and a human capital element in this.
Yeah, precisely, Maggie. I'm shaking my head listening to these comments because they're spot on from an industry perspective. I'll speak a bit about the dashboard and the criticality of that. Being able to see around the bend is what is so important. One phenomenal case study with that right now is what's going on with the chip shortage as a result of the pandemic. So there's one thing to have these market fluctuations. There's one thing to have these logistical hurdles. The logistical hurdles, those are the weather based disruptions that we're seeing. Those are the Suez Canal instances that we're seeing that present these logistical hurdles that companies have to adapt to. Then there's market fluctuations. I don't think, it would have ever been predicted that a pandemic would have caused a chip shortage. And this is where these advanced analytics, this AI can help us see this, help us predict this, and help us understand it. But then, going back to, the human element of it, advanced manufacturing is critical to what 3M does. Without advanced manufacturing, we would not be able to respond to these disruptions. We would not be able to have that balance between efficiency and resiliency. We have to have the workforce to be able to respond quickly to it. I was glad when that supply chain report came out yesterday that this was mentioned in there as a critical element. So I think we're on the right path to being able to address this.
Bob, we have a question coming in from the audience. I think that you're best positioned to answer this, but you'll let me know. This is from Jared B. What would the consolidation of supply chains under a single logistics system, I'm looking at PRC's Login K, National Logistics Information System, mean for international stability? Login K seems poised to fill a standard-setting role in international logistics. Bob, any response to that? Do we need a standard?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a strong view on that, or I don't have enough background to answer that, Maggie. Sorry, I'm not gonna.
Okay, no worries. Kelly, I know we have a question coming in for you as well. Again, let me know if you're in a position to answer this. This is from Thomas Blanford, Office of Representative Scott Fitzgerald. Black swans can be hard to predict, but cyber black swans seem to be even tougher. What are some cyber black swans that DoD is preparing for, and where can Congress best support DoD's efforts to support those mitigating efforts? I think Gilman already established that black swans are black swans because we cannot predict them, but maybe you can talk to what the Department of Defense, where Congress can best support DoD's efforts to support that.
This is a great question. So I agree, black swans are black swans. They're not predictable, but what we can do, we know that we have vulnerabilities. That's, I think that's information that's widely available, and we're trying to do the right things to resolve them. So basic hygiene, right? That's something that we need to continue to support, and we would look for the support of Congress as we resource that and as we do that hard work. And even though it's, it's hygiene, so it doesn't sound very cool, but that is the best defense as far as like at a low level, is just to have good cybersecurity hygiene across the board for all of our networks, for all of our systems. Obviously at DoD, we're doing some things that are exquisite, and we're doing those for our most important assets and our most important data. And there we, obviously we have partnerships throughout the department. So Cybercom, NSA, these are our key partners as we protect our most important information. And there we're doing more than just hygiene, obviously. But I would say, cybersecurity is something that has been increasingly important over the past decade. And I think as we pivot to a zero trust posture, I'm trying to sort of put forward this idea that knowing that an adversary has breached our networks, that doesn't mean that we've failed, right? That's something that is going to happen. But when it happens, we need to identify it rapidly and we need to remove them rapidly. And so that's, as we move to zero trust, we're changing from like we have a moat and there's alligators in it and there's no way you can, no. Absolutely, we have a moat and absolutely there's alligators in it. But also, in case something manages to get through that, we're going to find you and we're going to get out of there. So the pivot to zero trust is what we're, I think, most excited about from a cybersecurity perspective.
John, one of the things that strike me as we talk through this conversation is that there are so many concerns about cybersecurity. We've seen the examples recently, and we find ourselves also talking in the same breath about a pandemic, about weather-related problems. I mean, securing the supply chain whoever's responsible for that is getting hit from man-made and Mother Nature threats. How much does that complicate that? And how do we prioritize? Do we have to, or can these solutions address both sides of that?
Yeah, the critical aspect here, it's been kind of referenced, is planning, and planning for contingencies. DoD, and I'm just speaking from my time, my 30 plus years in DoD, it's all about planning, and planning is everything. Plans are sometimes worthless, but it gives you an ability to pivot and demonstrate agility to respond to those black swan and unanticipated events. So it's very important to plan. It's very important, perhaps it's kind of a DoD term, to have a strategic war reserve. And I'm not quite sure exactly what the correct business term would be, but to have a little bit of flex in the system, so that there is a little bit of extra items, componentry, et cetera, if there is a disruption. Mm-hmm. And then also about the systems. There's a lot of these industrial control systems, a lot of these critical infrastructure systems. These are the kind of, until very, very recently, kind of the forgotten aspect of cybersecurity. Exactly, we've been spending so much time on the desktop environment. A lot of these critical infrastructure systems, a lot of them are actually old. They actually still work. They actually work quite efficiently. And the challenge is, how do you essentially retrofit, upgrade without blocking delivery and level of service or breaking them? So that is the real important element, is how do we backfit? How do we make sure some of these systems are secure? And some of them may need updating, and that's good too. And then we'll get that modern cybersecurity into these systems. And as Kelly mentioned here, the term cyber hygiene. And for several years, we measured in good detail, essentially the state of the department, the entire Department of Defense, actually some components of the intelligence community. We found pretty consistently about 95 to 97% of the issues were the basics: two-factor authentication, mm-hmm. spear phishing, the insider. So that high-end peer nation-state competitors such as China or Russia was really only in that 2 to 3% window. Most of the problems and most of the issues were resolved by taking care of those basics. And a lot of the critical infrastructure does not have two-factor authentication, and that old spear phishing thing actually can be quite damaging. And then also the insider threat. So taking care of the basics there and addressing it, but also being able to plan and being able to show agility and the ability to pivot, so that we can contain or demonstrate a continuity of operations.
Bob, I've got to think that that your folks are looking very closely at the issues that John just raised.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can't agree more with John. You know, we start to try to push that guidance out as it relates for the federal government, in making sure that we are supporting CIOs and providing them with tools as they move towards zero trust. We have things that we need to do along the lines of what Kelly was talking about in terms of critical software identification, and making sure that we are then pushing best practices on how to look at critical software, et cetera. I think one of the things we haven't talked about that much right now is the power which comes into the supply chain conversation, the power of contracts, the power of updated language, the power of making sure that this is part of business arrangements and creating business incentives as suppliers enter into relationships with, as people enter into relationships with their suppliers. And mandating that there's security, that there's illumination, that there's incident reporting, and that there's the ability, particularly for your key suppliers, to look at their practices in place. Because it comes down, supply chains come down to having trust that they're going to be there, that the products are going to be there when you need it through your supply chains, and that they're going to be safe, secure, and not introduce risk into your systems. and the business relationship, the contracts, making sure that that's absolutely a part of what gets prioritized as you're buying things securely is a big thing that we're pushing here at CISA.
That is a fantastic point, Bob. And I know even when you're talking about disclosure, a couple of days waiting to try to clean up the mess before you say anything to anyone else in your industry or your peers has huge implications. We've seen that over and over again, and yet that hesitancy, because of the backlash and the damage reputationally that comes with that, is so difficult to overcome. So the idea of building that into contracts is so interesting. I'm going to get Kelly's thoughts on that.
Shared more broadly. So if 3M finds out something that happens with one of their suppliers, we would hope we would set up a structure where 3M felt able to share it with what sometimes might be thought of as competitors, but in reality are part of an overall ecosystem and not just hoarding information themselves. And there are things government can do to encourage more information sharing, and that's what we're committed to doing.
Fantastic. Brittany, let's bring you in. Not only off of that, I also want to bring in a question. So feel free to respond to that, sort of building that ecosystem in a moment. But we do have a question coming in from Maureen Russell, and I think this is interesting. It touches on this sort of tension between sharing and cooperation and competitiveness. And this is when we're talking about the dashboard. She asked, do we really want a real-time dashboard? Wouldn't the private sector have concerns about their proprietary information leaking? I would think that would be something hackers target.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'll come back to that. Let me mention briefly what Bob said and caveat on that. I think that having that information sharing is critical, absolutely positively critical. And this is where I believe that the government can play a very strong role in not only facilitating it, but also incentivizing it, and also making sure that there's a regulatory framework that supports it. Make sure that we have those protections so that our proprietary information does not become vulnerable as a result of that information sharing, because that's the disincentive to be able to adopt those types of frameworks, truth be told. I also want to comment on something that John said when he was mentioning planning. It's critical. I understand that black swans are what they are. It's not always easy to be able to plan for them. But what we do at 3M is we have a twofold approach. Number one, it's identifying where our vulnerabilities are, working to prevent them, making sure that we don't have these single source providers, making sure that we don't have a geographic concentration of our critically needed materials, making sure that we understand our supply chain very, very thoroughly, but then also working to mitigate it when something does happen, using those advanced analytics, using that advanced manufacturing, making sure that we're equipped even when something does get through. The dashboard becomes important in that, like I mentioned, it helps us see around the bend. In terms of protecting our proprietary information, have the framework in place for us to be able to do that. 3M does have a lot of proprietary information that we like to keep under lock and key, but I don't think that prevents us from being able to absorb the analytics, share the information that's needed to have the algorithms in place, to be able to have these sensors and other metrics in place that Gilliam had spoke to in the beginning. So I think there's a way that we can strike that balance for certain.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. Kelly, I want you to weigh in on all of the above that we just talked about, because these are practical things that we can be doing to try to move the ball along. And it's important, I think, to provide those incentives to the market.
Absolutely. So, yeah, and I guess like my message to our partners, our industrial partners is, we're starting to pay really close and careful attention to this, and both from a software perspective and from hardware, actual things. So we really appreciate folks who are looking closely at their own supply chains, and we're going to start to pay even closer attention in the future. The other thing I'd like to mention is partnership with industry, incredibly important, hugely important. But a place where I've recently been spending quite a bit of time is our partnership with our allies. So, these are global supply chains. I may not have the same insight as someone in Australia has. They're going to have information that I may not have. So at the CIO level, we have a lot of meetings with other Ministry of Defense or, CIOs. And we share information on a whole variety of topics. But this is one where we're all starting to pivot to look at our own supply chains and how our supply chains overlap with one another.
And they most certainly do. We have an interesting question, very open-ended, but interesting question coming in from the audience. And John, I'll start with you. This is from Arvind from Temple University in Philadelphia, and it's for the full panel. In 5 years' time, how will supply chain management have changed compared to today? Put another way, is there such a thing as an ideal supply chain we should be striving for? John, where do you think the focus is going to be?
Well, thank you. A great question. So modern supply chain concepts really, in many ways, I would trace it to essentially the arrival of the Japanese car companies and car production system that really sent a shock through the American car production system in the 70s. And that's where we really can draw the intersection with basic concepts as Lean Six Sigma, Kaizen, and essentially just in time, very, very efficient supply chains. What we now have to do, and after we've gone through this year plus of what happens when this very efficient supply chain somehow sand is thrown into the gears, regardless of who or how, and what do we do about it? And we realize, okay, yes, those efficient supply chains have provided great benefits to customers, great to companies, but now we have to build in a resilience capability so that when that sand is thrown into the gears, and it will be thrown into the gears, how do we adjust? And that means maybe revisiting some of these past concepts. I mentioned maybe perhaps maintaining a little bit of slack in the system, but we have to be very vigilant that that little bit of slack doesn't turn into big slack and waste. So we're going to have to revisit these concepts and then improve upon what for 30, 40 years gave us in many ways a very good supply chain system.
Brittany, it does seem that we're at a pivot point. We talked about Gilman and questions from the audience of redefining what we mean by efficiency. I know 3M is already sort of working in this direction about how you can build in more resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another consideration too is, outside of just the reflections from the last year on how we saw so many disruptions, but also looking forward at policy agendas and policy ambitions. For example, policy to mitigate climate change, the impact that that's going to have on supply chains. Being able to forecast how we can be supportive in these kinds of ambitions, but not lose our efficiency, make sure we maintain our resiliency. I think that in 5 years' time, supply chains are beginning to look a lot leaner and a lot cleaner. For example, 3M, we try to keep our supply chains as lean as possible. We manufacture as close to our customers as we can, and we source as close to our manufacturing as possible. I think we're going to see leaner. I think cybersecurity is going to become increasingly important. A lot of organizations have that as an identified weakness, but are still a bit lost in trying to patch up those holes, no pun intended. I think we're going to see increased resiliency in terms of cyber. And lastly, I am excited to see that governments around the globe are viewing supply chains as a national security imperative. That lets me know that the government is going to acknowledge themselves as an active participant in how supply chains are structured and begin to collaborate more closely with industry. So I think we're trending in a positive direction, and I'm very optimistic about us being able to get to that ideal supply chain balance within the next 5 to 10 years.
And we certainly saw, I know there is, for all that we've been through in the last year, there is reason to be optimistic because we saw what was possible when there was cooperation, collaboration, people coming together to solve an immediate problem. I don't think anyone wants to do it under duress like that again. But certainly things happened that many thought would have been impossible. Bob, as you look to the future, I think Brittany just brought up a really interesting point about, when we're looking at cybersecurity, especially, there are companies who are a little bit lost or trying to play catch up, but maybe not there. What can they do? How can they move down the road faster and further? What would your advice be?
Sure. I think it gets to process a little bit, and it's thematic around supply chain and cyber. It's got to be part of your overall enterprise risk governance approach. It's got to be part of your business decision making. And that's what we're trying to push within the government. There are tools out there. There are processes out there. there are things to do. If you invest the money, if you pay attention to it, if you plan, if you run playbooks, if you exercise, if you acknowledge it as something that the absolute top of an organization is accountable for, improvements get made. We'll keep pushing out things that will allow hopefully efficiencies in those improvements. But the fact is, it starts with attention at the top. We're trying to do that from a national security perspective, but I'd say across the whole organization. And so
Yeah. Well, it's certainly government has a huge platform that it can leverage to help with this when we're talking about public-private cooperation. Kelly, again, what do you think the changes will look like? Is there an ideal supply chain, model? Or maybe the better question is, how do we prioritize? What can companies who know they're not there, what can they do, and what kind of help can they look for from the government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and just to answer the first question, what does 5 years look like? I hope in 5 years I have a picture perfect understanding of my supply chain. So, I mean, it would be awesome to be predictive in 5 years, and I'm going to be a robot. No. I hope that I have total understanding of what my supply chain looks like, and that I have taken action on those most high risk areas, right? That I've prioritized within my portfolio to say, here's a platform that's absolutely critical, and there are some problems in the supply chain that I know about, and now I'm taking action to resolve them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's actually the first step for everyone, is to say, what does my supply chain look like? Really get down, look at the full breadth of it, look at the full depth of it, and use those commercial tools that are available just to get some indications, right? They'll give you a score. Maybe don't focus on that, but focus on where you're seeing indications of concern.
Yeah, understand what you can do. John, we're almost out of time. I'm just going to leave it with you with the last word. I think that we see that we're at a pivot point. Do you feel hopeful that we're going to get the kind of cooperation that we need in order to be able to utilize all of these tools? I mean, we heard Gilman start this off, and I just want to bring you back around to this point. It seems like we have more technology at our disposal than we ever had. Yes, the threats are rising, but so are the tools that we have at our disposal when we look at AI and intelligence coming from space, and the ability to really see things on a granular level and put together a picture that we never could before. How do you view this, and are you hopeful that we can make the changes we need to secure the supply chain?
So Gilman was on the National Commission for AI, and we also work with them as a aerospace corporation. And I think modern AI, the missing ingredient which modern AI delivers, is the ability not just to process the data, but to action the data. That is the key thing that is now being brought up and being delivered, actioning the data to deliver that, again, air quote, mythical dashboard, so we can have that decisive clarity. What we learned over the last year, I think, is an incentive also for information sharing. When before I retired from DoD, international partnerships were a huge part of my portfolio, and that was a key topic and theme at all times, was information sharing between the U.S. government and these key international partners, but also even with these international partners internally, because even though the U.S. government doesn't always operate as efficiently as we would want it to, actually we're a pretty good model, and a number of these other partners learn from us because they have a far greater Drake coefficient in their internal works to share among their enterprises. So information sharing is important. And just having that strategic clarity, and so we can identify these events. And the Ever Given, the Taiwanese ship in the Suez Canal, is very interesting. And perhaps maybe once our systems are more mature, we can kind of identify how things, what happened. We can identify that. Why did that ship suddenly take a hard starboard, hard right turn and decide to wedge itself in the canal, which just threw a wrench into the global supply chain. So if we could have had a better visibility on cybersecurity, perhaps we could have seen, well, how did that command get in there? How was that command sent to the ship? If that is what happened.
Yeah, I mean, this is all about not only securing it, but being able to be smart enough to prevent it and to respond quickly, so that we don't see, the sort of outcomes that we did. And certainly, I feel a lot more positive that we'll be able to do that after speaking to all of you. So thank you all so much for joining us. You brought a lot of expertise and ideas and tangible ideas to the conversation, and that's what it's all about. So thank you so much, Dr. Kelly Fletcher, Bob Kalowski, John Mills, and Brittany Masala-Sala for 3M. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
It's certainly
Thanks.
been a fantastic conversation, a learning experience, and my pleasure to host that. Now, thank you again also to BlackSky, who is supporting this event. Now, a full recording of it will be available shortly on FP's event page at foreignpolicy.com/events. And please stay tuned for much more from FP. Later this month, we're planning lots more events on diverse and equally fascinating topics. Specifically of interest to this audience may be another supply chain conversation, this one focused specifically on health and strengthening the supply chains that underpin national and local health systems. We know how important that is. That will be building resilience across global health supply chains on June 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Stay tuned for updates and find out more on foreignpolicy.com/events. Thank you so much. Take care. We'll see you soon.